Hi, welcome to the video on ablative absolutes. This is Mr. Hayden from Divine Child High School. In this video, we're going to be explaining the basics behind what is an ablative absolute and how is it structured in Latin. And so I'm going to try to be brief, so please keep in mind that I'm going to leave out a lot of basic things like the nature of participles and the cases, assuming that by this point you know both. You cannot do ablative absolutes without knowing your cases and your forms, and you cannot do ablative absolutes without knowing your participles. And so, without further ado, we're going to move on to ablative absolutes themselves in a basic format, and then do an example together to finish up the video, and hopefully this is going to be less than 10 minutes. So we're dealing with what we call an absolute statement. An absolute statement is not what it sounds like. You're thinking of something that's like very, very true or something like that. But an absolute statement is something that simply gives you a circumstance under which another thing is true. And so you have to remember that these are adverbial. They're adverbial statements that tell you the circumstance or context under which the main clause would be true, or the clause it modifies would be true. And it's kind of the equivalent of saying when, since, or if, depending on that context. And I'll give you an example or two here in a second, but it's important to remember that these are adverbial statements, and they give circumstance. Examples in English. When you say like that being said, if I say like that being said, I'm still going to the park today. That would be an interesting thing if I had just talked about the weather or something like that. So if I was like praising how sunny it is, it's like, oh, the sun is shining so much. That being said, I'm going to the park today. That being said is the circumstance under which I should go to the park. And then you can say like that would be the equivalent of since. Like, so since it's sunny outside, or since I just said that, I'm going to the park today. And here's an example that you might see like as a translation of a Latin sentence. With Caesar having been killed, the Senate tried to restore the Republic. Notice the with Caesar having been killed. I did it with very specific grammar language. The with in there, with the hint of what case you're going to see. Obviously, these are called ablative absolutes, so we're seeing an ablative there with the with. The having been killed is another hint to what you're going to see in the Latin because you see a participle there. So with Caesar having been killed, the Senate tried to restore the Republic. I just wanted to, in English, give you this example so that we can talk a second about what that means. The fact that Caesar was killed gives you the circumstance under which the Senate tried to restore the Republic. And you can almost replace it with a since Caesar was killed, the Senate tried to restore the Republic, or when Caesar was killed, the Senate tried to restore the Republic. It is the circumstance under which the Senate tried to restore the Republic, Caesar being a tyrant. So let's go to the next slide and we'll start looking at these in Latin. So we begin in Latin, and this is the structure that we're dealing with an ablative absolute. Ablative noun plus ablative participle. You'll note that you're still going to use the word with. So that's going to be a friendly friend for you, where you can say, well, the ablative is often translated with, and therefore you're still going to use the word with, and that's going to be something you can cling to at first. You'll note you'll need to recognize participles a little bit here, and they can be any participles. They can be perfect passive participles. They can be the present active participles. They can be any kind of participle. You can have a deponent participle in there. Any kind of participle will do as long as it agrees with that ablative noun. It must agree. Must agree. All right, so I gave you an example down below, and in the translation, you're going to hear how this is going to sound. It's going to be almost formulaic. See, aqua in casam lata, familia bibere poterat. It's a very basic sentence, but you'll notice you have an ablative noun, ablative participle, and you see that in prose, often these will bookend the clause. And yes, you use square brackets on them because they are indeed, like most ablatives, adverbial. So your translation here is with the water having been carried into the house. the family was able to drink. Notice the with and the having been. And this is from the example in the previous slide I showed you in English of how that worked. The with is still present because of the aqua ablative, and then lata being the perfect passive participle of fero, fere, tuli, latos, is the having been carried. With the water having been carried into the house, comma, you finish the sentence, the family was able to drink. And so you can see the circumstance under which the family was able to drink is that the water was brought into the house. And so you can kind of think about this. I don't want you to translate it as such because I want a literal translation, but you can think about it as like since the water was brought into the house, the family was able to drink, or when the water was brought into the house, the family was able to drink. I think it's very helpful to think of these as clauses, as things to bracket off, because they almost act like a when or since. But hopefully this makes a little bit of sense, and we can kind of do two more examples here in a second. All right, we're going to do two examples quickly. I'm not going to write out each translation, so you can rewind if you need to. The reasoning is I don't want to take too much time writing, and my handwriting is awful anyway. All right, so in the first example, we see Brutus, Caesare Gladio in Pompeii Teatro Interfecto, inquit sic semper tyrannis. And so you see there's I commaed off the ablative absolute for you, and you can say, okay, Brutus is the subject. Caesar starts a clause with the e, and the interfecto, make sure you know it's agreeing with it. So this kind of, again, you're getting that bookending of the ablatives. In the sentence, I purposely gave you more ablatives to deal with so that you're like, okay, well, it could be the gladio agreeing with interfecto, fine. But it's going to be weird if you say, with the sword having been killed. Swords can't die. And so you can see the natural bookending of the subject of the ablative absolute and its verb. So now we have a new case use, the ablative subject. Because if these are clauses, they need subjects and verbs. So you have a participle that is a verb and an ablative subject of an ablative absolute. That is now a new ablative use. But it is not the subject of the main sentence. Keep in mind we are still bracketing that off. You can see in green. So we have here, with Caesar having been killed with a sword in the theater of Pompey. So there's the circumstance. With Caesar having been killed by a sword in the theater of Pompey, Brutus said, sic semper tyrannis, so always for tyrants. And you see the circumstances under which Brutus yells, so always for tyrants, is that Caesar was killed with a sword in the theater of Pompey. Again, you will note ablative noun, ablative participle, with Caesar having been killed. Notice it's a perfect passive participle. That leads me to the next example here, because we don't need to have a perfect passive participle. We can have any kind of participle here. So we have Antonio Cleopatram amante, Octavianus nuntiavit eum esse Egyptium. If those of you that are paying attention, this is an ACI here, so that's kind of cool. I put that in there for you. That has nothing to do with ablative absolutes. I was just throwing that in there. And to contrast it, I'm going to use blue for the ablative absolute here. All right, so you see your O ending here, Antonio. Amante has an E ending, and so you're like, all right, that's got to be your ablative absolute. You have your NT, so it's a PAP. It agrees with Antonio. Nice bookending of the ablatives there. This will not always be the case. It will not always bookend nicely. However, in prose, it's an ideal. It won't always be realized, but it's an ideal. This one I like because you have an active participle, which allows you to have a direct object within the ablative absolute. So Cleopatram is a DO of just the ablative amante. So your translation here, with Mark Antonius, loving Cleopatra. Notice the ing of the PAP. You don't need the having been anymore. So with Anthony loving Cleopatra, Octavian announced that he was an Egyptian, which is kind of a propaganda, harsh statement against Anthony, a good Roman man. Well, good's relative, but... So anyway, that's another example. So of these two, just to review one more time, you get on the first one, with Caesar having been killed with a sword in the theater of Pompey as the ablative absolute. And in the second one, the ablative absolute is with Anthony loving Cleopatra with that other PAP kind of participle. Finally, the last thing about absolutes that you need to know for now in the introduction is that they are used to tell what year it was in the Roman Republic and the Empire. This is because they did not have the kind of the centered year around Christ's birth and death to tell what year it was. So we essentially count down from Christ's birth, or count up, sorry, from Christ's birth. When we tell the years, the Romans did not have that cultural focus, and so they had to just kind of say, like, well, when this guy and this guy were consuls, because consulships were a single year. And so to tell what year it was, they would simply say when this guy and this guy were consuls. And if somebody doesn't study their own country's history, they might be a little confused. So it got a little bit confusing, but I think that it was okay for most Romans. They could at least look it up. Anyway, it's in the form of an ablative absolute, and you see it here with Caesariat Bibulo consolibus. This is, of course, when Caesar and Bibulus were consuls. The health of the Republic was sick, was not good. And so you can still translate it as with these guys, and then you have to kind of insert the participle. There is no participle of to be, and therefore you have to insert like a being in there. With Caesar and Bibulus being the consuls, the health of the Republic was ill. And Caesar and Bibulus were consuls in 59 BC. So it's essentially saying in 59 BC, the health of the Republic was ill. But this is the Roman way of saying it, when this guy and this guy were consuls. With that, we can end the video on ablative absolutes. So thank you for watching.